It was Christmas Eve in the sleepy town of Ashton Hollow, where snow blanketed the rooftops and twinkling lights cast a warm glow over the quiet streets. For Evelyn and her family, it was a long-awaited reunion. Her parents, her brother Mark, and her niece Lila had traveled miles to celebrate the holiday in her new home, a charming yet isolated Victorian house on the outskirts of town. The house, though picturesque, had a peculiar history. Evelyn had learned it was once the home of a recluse who vanished without a trace decades ago. The townsfolk spoke of strange occurrences there, lights flickering, phantom footsteps, but Evelyn had dismissed it as small-town folklore. Tonight, she was determined to make the house feel alive with laughter, food, and the joy of family. Dinner had been a lively affair, with Lila excitedly talking about the gifts under the tree. Mark joked about Evelyn's overly large Christmas wreath, and their mother fussed over her eggnog recipe. But as the clock struck 10 and the family settled in the living room for a movie, a subtle shift in the atmosphere began to take hold. The first sign was the snow. Evelyn noticed it falling heavier, obscuring the windows like a thick, impenetrable curtain. The howling wind followed, shaking the house as if trying to pry it apart. The storm had come suddenly, and it was unusually fierce, even for Ashton Hollow. "Looks like we're snowed in," Mark remarked with a nervous chuckle. Evelyn nodded, trying to shake off the unease creeping into her chest. As the family cozied up on the couch, Lila ran to grab a blanket from the hallway closet. Moments later, her scream pierced the air. Evelyn and Mark rushed to her side, finding her trembling at the foot of the stairs. "There was someone up there," Lila stammered, pointing to the darkened second floor. "A man. He was standing at the top." Mark immediately grabbed a fireplace poker while Evelyn tried to calm Lila. Their father joined them, grumbling about kids and their overactive imaginations, but Mark wasn't convinced. He insisted they check the house. Together, they crept upstairs, the old floorboards groaning under their weight. The hallway stretched ahead, its shadows twisting in the flickering light from Evelyn's flashlight. They checked every room, her bedroom, the guest rooms, even the attic. Nothing. "See? No one's here," their father said, a hint of irritation in his voice. But as they turned to head back downstairs, Evelyn froze. At the end of the hallway, the attic door, which they had just closed, was now slightly ajar. "Didn't we shut that?" Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. Mark nodded, gripping the poker tighter. He stepped forward, pulling the door open with a creak. The attic was empty, save for a few cobweb-covered boxes and an old rocking chair. "Let's go back," Evelyn urged, the unease now a tangible weight pressing on her chest. They returned to the living room, but the cheer had been drained from the night. Lila sat clutching her blanket, her wide eyes darting to the staircase every few seconds. The storm raged on outside, the wind shrieking like a living thing. At midnight, the power went out. The living room was plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the fireplace. Evelyn fumbled for her phone, but the battery was nearly dead. Mark's flashlight flickered weakly before going out entirely. "Great," their father muttered. "We'll light some candles." As they scrambled to find light, Evelyn heard it, faint at first, then growing louder. A scraping sound like metal dragging against wood coming from above. "It's the attic," Mark whispered, his face pale in the dim light. No one wanted to acknowledge it, but they all heard it, the unmistakable sound of the rocking chair moving back and forth, back and forth. Suddenly, Lila screamed again. "He's here! He's watching us!" Evelyn spun around, her blood turning to ice. In the faint light of the fireplace, she saw it too. A shadowy figure stood at the edge of the room, just beyond the glow of the flames. Its form was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by the darkness. Mark lunged forward with the poker, but the figure vanished, leaving only the sound of the wind. "Everyone upstairs, now!" Evelyn shouted, grabbing Lila and dragging her toward the stairs. The family bolted to Evelyn's bedroom, slamming the door shut and shoving a dresser in front of it. They huddled together, the silence broken only by their ragged breaths. Evelyn held Lila close, whispering soothing words despite the terror clawing at her throat. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. It was impossible to tell. The storm outside finally began to die down, and the first light of dawn seeped through the cracks in the curtains. Summoning her courage, Evelyn moved the dresser and opened the door. The hallway was empty, the house eerily still. They crept downstairs, half expecting to find the shadowy figure waiting for them. But there was nothing. Everything seemed untouched, except for the attic door. It hung open again, swaying slightly as if beckoning them. Mark approached it cautiously, and when he climbed the steps to peer inside, he gasped. "What is it?" Evelyn called out, her voice trembling. Mark descended slowly, his face ashen. In his hand, he held an old faded photograph. It showed a family sitting in the very same living room, their faces eerily similar to Evelyn's own family. But in the corner of the photo, partially obscured, stood the same shadowy figure they had seen the night before. "We're leaving," Evelyn said firmly, grabbing her keys. They never returned to the house, and despite her best efforts, Evelyn couldn't sell it. Rumors in Ashton Hollow claim the lights in the attic still flicker, and on quiet nights, passersby can hear the creak of a rocking chair moving back and forth.
Story number 2.
Christmas had always been a magical time for Erin. This year, she decided to spend it with her boyfriend, Adam, at his family's cabin deep in the woods of Maine. The cabin was secluded, surrounded by snow-covered pines and far from the chaos of the city. It was Adam's idea to escape the bustling crowds for a quiet, intimate holiday, and Erin was thrilled at the thought. The cabin was cozy, adorned with old-fashioned decorations, wooden nutcrackers, faded garlands, and a vintage Santa figurine on the mantel. Adam's family had owned the place for generations, and it had the charm of a time long past. The first night was perfect. They sipped hot chocolate by the fireplace and exchanged small gifts. Erin felt warm, safe, and happy. But that feeling didn't last. On the second night, Erin woke to a faint tapping sound. She rolled over, groggy, and nudged Adam. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. He grunted, but didn't wake. The tapping continued, faint and rhythmic, like fingernails drumming against glass. Erin slipped out of bed and peered out the frost-covered window. Her breath caught in her throat. A figure stood just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the moonlight. It was tall, with impossibly long limbs, and its head was tilted unnaturally to one side, as though its neck had been broken. "Adam!" she hissed, backing away from the window. By the time Adam groggily joined her, the figure was gone. "You probably just saw a tree," he muttered, rubbing his eyes. "Go back to bed." But Erin couldn't shake the image. She spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside. The next morning, Adam went out to chop firewood while Erin stayed inside to clean up. She couldn't shake the unease that had settled over her. Every creak of the cabin made her jump, and the silence outside felt oppressive. As she dusted the mantel, her eyes fell on the vintage Santa figurine. Something about it seemed different. Its painted smile looked sharper, its eyes darker. She could have sworn it had been holding a sack the night before, but now its tiny hands were empty. "Adam, did you move this?" she called out, holding the figurine. "What?" he shouted back, his voice muffled by the wind. "This Santa thing. Did you—" A loud crash cut her off. She dropped the figurine and rushed to the window. Adam was lying in the snow, his axe several feet away. She bolted outside, the icy wind cutting through her pajamas. "Adam!" she screamed, kneeling beside him. He was unconscious, a gash on his forehead. As she tried to rouse him, she noticed something in the snow. Footprints. They weren't Adam's. The prints were large, uneven, as though whatever made them had been dragging its feet. They circled the area where Adam had fallen and disappeared into the woods. When Adam finally came to, he brushed off her concerns. "I slipped, that's all," he insisted, though his eyes darted nervously toward the tree line. That night, Erin locked every door and window. Adam seemed unusually quiet, retreating to bed early, leaving her alone by the fire. As she stared into the flames, she heard it again. The tapping. It was louder this time, insistent. Erin grabbed the fireplace poker and crept toward the sound. It was coming from the front door. Holding her breath, she peered through the peephole. The figure was back, closer now. Its face was pale and featureless, as though it had been carved from wax. Its limbs hung at odd angles, and it swayed slightly, as if blown by a breeze that Erin couldn't feel. "Go away," she shouted, her voice shaking. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then came the scratching, a slow, deliberate scraping against the wooden door. Erin backed away, her heart pounding. "Adam!" she screamed, running to the bedroom. But Adam wasn't there. The bed was empty, the sheets cold. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. Erin grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. Desperate, she locked herself in the bathroom, clutching the poker like a lifeline. The noise stopped. For several minutes, there was only the sound of her ragged breathing. Then, from the other side of the bathroom door, she heard Adam's voice. "Erin, it's me. Open the door." Relief flooded her. She unlocked the door, but as it swung open, her relief turned to terror. It wasn't Adam. The thing standing before her had his face, but its eyes were empty voids, and its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. It lunged for her. Erin screamed and swung the poker, connecting with a sickening crack. The thing stumbled back, its form flickering like a distorted image on an old TV. She ran, her bare feet slipping on the wooden floor. Outside, the storm had intensified, but she didn't care. She sprinted into the woods, the icy air burning her lungs. Behind her, she heard it following, its footsteps crunching in the snow, faster and faster. She didn't stop until she reached the highway, flagging down a passing car. The driver, an older man, stared at her in shock as she babbled about the cabin, the figure, and Adam. By the time the police arrived, the cabin was empty. There was no sign of Adam or the thing that had worn his face, but on the mantel they found the vintage Santa figurine. Its painted grin was wider than ever, and in its tiny hands it held a blood-stained axe.
Story number 3.
The snowstorm had begun earlier than forecasted, turning the usually bustling town of Ash Hollow into a desolate white wasteland. Mira was driving through the blizzard, gripping the steering wheel tightly as she squinted through the windshield. She regretted taking the back roads, but the main highway was shut down due to the storm, and she was desperate to get home in time for Christmas Eve dinner with her family. The GPS signal flickered, and the screen went dark. Mira groaned and tapped it, but it didn't respond. She glanced at her phone. No service. Great, she muttered. The snow was coming down harder now, the road barely visible. The headlights illuminated an old wooden sign ahead, the words barely legible under a thick layer of frost. Red Pines Lodge, 2 miles. A lodge. Somewhere warm. Mira hesitated for a moment before deciding to turn onto the narrow path leading to the lodge. She told herself it was just to wait out the storm. The path was winding and lined with towering pine trees that seemed to close in around her. When the lodge finally came into view, it looked like something out of an old postcard, large and rustic, with a wraparound porch and Christmas lights faintly glowing under the snow. But something about it felt wrong. The parking lot was empty, save for a single rusted pickup truck. Mira parked her car and made her way to the front door, the snow crunching under her boots. The wind howled and the cold bit at her skin. She knocked on the heavy wooden door. After a few moments, it creaked open, revealing a man who looked to be in his 60s. He was tall and thin, with deep-set eyes and a face weathered like old leather. "Lost?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "Just looking for a place to wait out the storm," Mira said, her breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The man nodded slowly and stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. The warmth inside was immediate, but it did little to ease her unease. The lodge's interior was dimly lit, with a roaring fire in a stone hearth. Christmas decorations were scattered about. An old tree adorned with antique ornaments, stockings hung crookedly on the mantel, and a cracked porcelain nativity set on a table. "Name's Frank," the man said, closing the door behind her. "Mira, thank you for letting me in." He nodded again and motioned to a chair by the fire. "Storm's bad. You'll need to stay the night." Mira hesitated. "I just need to wait for the roads to clear." "They won't clear till morning," Frank interrupted, his tone final. Unnerved, Mira sat by the fire. Frank disappeared into another room, leaving her alone. The lodge was eerily silent, save for the crackling fire and the distant sound of the wind. As she warmed her hands, Mira noticed a photograph on the mantel. It showed a family standing in front of the lodge, a younger Frank, a woman, and 2 children. The photo was old, faded, and stained with what looked like dried watermarks. "Nice family," she said aloud, more to herself. "They're gone now." Mira jumped. Frank had returned, standing in the doorway with a steaming mug in his hands. "Sorry," he said, handing her the mug. "Didn't mean to startle you." "Gone?" she asked, ignoring the drink. Frank's eyes darkened. Storms can be cruel out here. Before Mira could ask more, Frank abruptly left the room. Her unease deepened. As the hours dragged on, Mira tried to make small talk, but Frank remained distant and cryptic. Finally, exhaustion took over and she dozed off in the chair. She awoke to a sound, a faint melodic humming. Disoriented, she sat up and looked around. The room was dark, the fire reduced to embers. The humming grew louder, coming from somewhere upstairs. It was soft, like a lullaby, but there was something off about it. "Frank?" she called, her voice trembling. No response. Mira stood and made her way to the staircase, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The humming continued, now interspersed with faint whispers. She climbed the stairs, her hand trailing along the wooden banister. The second floor was even darker, the air colder. The humming led her to a closed door at the end of the hall. Her hand shook as she turned the knob. The room was empty, save for a rocking chair in the corner. It creaked back and forth, though there was no one in it. A faint, childlike giggle echoed through the room. Mira's breath hitched as she backed away. Her eyes darted to the walls, which were covered in faded wallpaper. The floral pattern seemed to twist and writhe, as if alive. She stumbled into the hall and nearly collided with Frank. "What are you doing up here?" he demanded, his face shadowed in the dim light. I heard something," Mira stammered. "Go back downstairs," he said, his tone icy. "Now." Terrified, she obeyed. Back by the fire, she tried to calm herself, but her unease grew into dread. The storm raged outside, but the lodge felt far more dangerous. As she sat there, she noticed something she hadn't before. The stockings on the mantel, each one bore a name. Frank, Eleanor, Thomas, Emily. The names from the photograph. Suddenly, the fire flared, casting shadows across the room. One shadow, larger than the others, didn't move with the flames. It loomed behind her, growing closer. Mira spun around, but there was nothing there. She bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. "Frank!" she screamed, pounding on the door. "Let me out!" The only response was the sound of the rocking chair upstairs, creaking steadily. And then the humming began again. This time, it was right behind her. Mira turned slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. Standing in the middle of the room were two children, their faces pale and expressionless. Their eyes were hollow, black pits, and their mouths stretched into unnatural grins. "Merry Christmas," they whispered in unison. The last thing Mira saw was the fire roaring to life, consuming the room in blinding light. When the storm cleared the next morning, the lodge stood empty, as it had for decades. The only sign of life was Mira's car, abandoned in the snow. Locals whispered about the ghostly lodge, haunted by a family lost in a Christmas Eve fire long ago. They warned travelers to stay away, but every few years someone ignored the warnings and was never seen again.
Story number 4.
The town of Pinehurst was one of those idyllic places that seemed ripped from a snow globe during the holidays. Twinkling lights lined every street, wreaths hung from every lamppost, and the scent of cinnamon and pine wafted through the air. For Jamie, however, Christmas was just another day to get through. She worked the late shift at the post office, sorting mail in the quiet hours of the night. It was a thankless job, especially during the holiday rush when the volume of packages seemed endless. That night, the snowstorm outside howled and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly as Jamie pushed her cart down the rows of P.O. boxes. Near the end of her route, she noticed a package on the sorting table that hadn't been there before. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, tied with twine, and had no return address. Odd, Jamie thought. She flipped it over, looking for a shipping label, but there wasn't one. Just a name scrawled in looping black ink. Jamie. Her stomach twisted. There was no way anyone could have brought it in. The doors were locked after 8 p.m., and no one else was working that night. She set the package down and stepped back, staring at it as though it might move. Probably just a prank, she muttered, trying to shake the unease creeping up her spine. But curiosity got the better of her. She untied the twine and peeled back the paper. Inside was a small, intricately carved wooden box. It was old, antique old, with strange symbols etched along its edges. When she opened it, the scent of burnt wood and something metallic wafted out. The only thing inside was a small folded piece of parchment. She unfolded it carefully, the paper crackling in her hands. The handwriting was jagged, almost frantic. "Do not look outside. Do not open the door. It wants in." Jamie's heart skipped. She looked around the room, half expecting someone to jump out and yell, "Gotcha!" But she was alone. A sudden bang echoed through the building, followed by another. It sounded like someone pounding on the metal back door. Jamie froze, the warning in the note echoing in her mind. "Do not open the door." The banging continued, louder and more insistent. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. No response. She grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. Typical in this weather. The storm had knocked out service before, but it felt ominous now. The pounding stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Jamie tiptoed toward the back door, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. She stared at the metal door, her breath fogging in the frigid air. And then she heard it, a soft, whispering voice, low and guttural, coming from the other side. "Jamie, let me in." Her blood turned to ice. It was her name, but the voice didn't sound human. It dragged the syllables, distorted and wrong, like multiple voices speaking at once. She backed away, her hands trembling. "Who's there?" she yelled, her voice cracking. The whispering stopped. Suddenly the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the exit sign. Jamie fumbled for her flashlight, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. When she turned it on, the beam landed on the sorting table. The box was gone. She spun around, shining the light in every direction, but the room was empty. A loud crash came from the lobby. It sounded like glass shattering. Against every instinct screaming at her to run, she moved toward the noise. The lobby's front windows were intact, but the Christmas decorations were in disarray. The garland was torn down, ornaments shattered across the floor, and the small tree lay toppled over. The snow outside had stopped, but the night was unnaturally dark. The streetlights, usually casting a warm glow, were out, leaving only the faint reflection of moonlight on the snow. And then she saw it. A figure stood just beyond the glass doors. Its shape was humanoid but wrong, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its face was obscured by the shadow, but its eyes glowed faintly, like embers. Jamie stumbled back, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. The figure raised one impossibly long arm and tapped a single claw-like finger against the glass. "Jamie?" it whispered again, the sound carrying unnaturally through the still air. Her flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into darkness once more. The sound of breaking glass erupted around her, and a bone-chilling wind swept through the room. She screamed and ran back into the sorting area, slamming the heavy door behind her. The pounding resumed, now against this door. Desperate, she grabbed the box cutter from her cart and held it in front of her like a weapon. She had no plan, no escape, just sheer terror coursing through her veins. The pounding stopped again. And then, silence. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time had lost meaning. Jamie didn't move, her back pressed against the cold concrete wall. Finally, she dared to crack the door open. The lobby was empty. She stepped out cautiously, her shoes crunching on the broken ornaments. The glass doors were intact again, as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. The package was back on the sorting table, neatly rewrapped. Her hands shook as she approached it. She didn't want to open it, but she couldn't leave it either. This time, the note inside had only 3 words. "You're too late." A shadow passed over the window, and the lights flickered once more. This time, they didn't come back on. Jamie wasn't seen again. Days later, the post office remained empty, her car still parked outside. The police found no signs of a struggle, no forced entry. The only clue was a small wooden box left on the floor, its lid ajar, and the faint scent of burnt wood lingering in the air.
Story number 5.
It had been years since anyone in the small town of Maple Hollow had gone caroling. The tradition had died out gradually, like the dimming flame of an old lantern. But this year, it was different. Layla had only recently moved to Maple Hollow, renting a small house at the edge of town. She wasn't much for Christmas festivities, but the peaceful town offered the solitude she craved after a messy breakup. The snow-coated streets and quiet evenings were a welcome change from the chaos she'd left behind. On Christmas Eve, as she sat by the fireplace sipping cocoa, a knock echoed through the house. Odd, she thought, setting her mug down. She wasn't expecting anyone. Peeking through the peephole, she saw a group of carolers standing on her porch. They were dressed in old-fashioned winter attire, long wool coats, scarves, and hats dusted with snow. Their faces were pale, their expressions blank. Layla hesitated. Carolers? Here? She opened the door slightly, the cold night air biting her cheeks. "Can I help you?" The group stood motionless for a moment, then began to sing, or at least they tried. Their mouths moved in unison, shaping the words of Silent Night, but no sound came out. The silence was suffocating, as if the world had suddenly been muted. Layla's unease grew as she watched them. Their movements were unnervingly synchronized, their blank eyes fixed on her. She noticed frost clinging to their clothes, and their breath didn't fog in the freezing air. Merry Christmas?" she stammered, closing the door quickly. She locked it and stepped back, her heart racing. Through the window, she saw them still standing on the porch, unmoving. The singing, or lack thereof, continued. Their mouths opened and closed, mouthing the lyrics to the next verse. Layla grabbed her phone, intending to call the police, but the signal was dead. Great, she thought, cursing the town's unreliable cell service. The carolers began moving then, not toward the street, but toward the side of her house. "What the hell?" she whispered, rushing to the kitchen window. They were circling her house, their steps slow and deliberate. Their heads turned in unison, their empty gazes fixed on her, no matter where she moved. The back door rattled. Layla ran to it, double-checking the lock. The knob twisted violently, and then the knocking started again, louder this time. Panicked, she grabbed the largest kitchen knife she could find and crouched behind the counter, her breathing shallow. The rattling stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the crackling fire in the living room. Then came the tapping on the windows. One by one, the carolers appeared, their faces pressed against the glass. Their expressions had changed, twisted smiles stretched across their faces, just their eyes wide and unblinking. Layla's blood turned to ice. She couldn't explain it, but she knew they weren't human. "Go away!" she screamed, but they didn't react. The singing began again, still silent, but now faster, more frantic. Their mouths moved at an unnatural speed, their heads twitching with each note. Layla backed away, clutching the knife. The fireplace went out suddenly, plunging the room into darkness. The silence was broken by the sound of shattering glass. She turned toward the living room, just in time to see one of them climbing through the broken window, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its pale face turned toward her, that grotesque grin widening as it stepped closer. Layla ran for the stairs, the sound of crunching glass and heavy footsteps following her. She barricaded herself in the bedroom, her hands trembling as she pushed the dresser against the door. She fumbled for her phone again, praying for a signal, but the screen remained blank. The singing started outside the bedroom door now, muffled but insistent. Their voices, still silent, were in her head, crawling through her thoughts like worms. "Come out! Sing with us!" She pressed her hands to her ears, but it didn't help. The sound grew louder, more invasive. The door creaked, the dresser sliding inch by inch as something pushed from the other side. Layla screamed as the door burst open and the carolers poured in. Their faces were no longer human, stretched and gaunt, their mouths impossibly wide, filled with jagged teeth. The last thing she saw was their hands reaching for her, cold and unyielding as the room filled with their silent song. When the townsfolk checked on her house the next morning, they found it empty. The windows were intact, the doors locked, and the fireplace still smoldering. But on the porch sat a small group of carolers, their faces pale and frozen, their mouths silently shaping the words to a song only they could hear.
Story number 6.
Every house on Evergreen Lane was decorated for the holidays, twinkling with lights, inflatable snowmen, and glowing reindeer. It was a tradition the neighborhood took seriously, except for the old house at the very end. It was always dark. No lights, no wreath, no sign of life. Mark, a single dad, had just moved into the neighborhood with his daughter Emma. The house they'd rented sat directly across from the dark, silent home. "Why don't they decorate?" Emma asked one night as they walked back from a holiday block party. "Maybe they don't celebrate Christmas," Mark said, trying to sound cheerful. Emma stared at the house, frowning. "It's creepy." Mark couldn't argue with that. The house had a neglected air, shutters hanging askew, paint peeling in long strips, the porch sagging ominously. The neighbors whispered about it. Some said it was abandoned. Others claimed someone lived there but never came outside. On Christmas Eve, after putting Emma to bed, Mark noticed something strange. The house across the street was glowing. Faint, multicolored lights shimmered in the windows, pulsating rhythmically, like a heartbeat. Mark squinted, unsure if he was imagining it. Curiosity got the better of him. He slipped on his coat and boots, stepping out into the freezing night. The snow crunched underfoot as he crossed the street. Up close, the house looked even more dilapidated. The lights flickered through the grimy windows, casting eerie patterns on the frost-covered glass. He knocked on the door, half expecting no one to answer. But it creaked open. The smell hit him first, a damp, rotting odor that made his stomach churn. "Hello," he called, his voice echoing. No answer. He stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The lights were brighter now, bathing the interior in an unsettling glow. The living room was empty, except for a Christmas tree. It was ancient, its branches bare in places, the needles brittle and brown. The ornaments were odd, handmade, with faces painted on them. The lights weren't strings of bulbs, they were orbs floating freely around the tree, emitting a soft hum. Mark's skin prickled as he realized the faces on the ornaments were moving. Their tiny eyes blinked, their mouths twisting as if they were trying to speak. He stepped back, bumping into something solid. Turning, he found himself face to face with a man. The figure was gaunt, his skin gray and stretched tightly over his skull. His eyes glowed faintly, matching the orbs. "You shouldn't have come here," the man rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark stumbled backward, tripping over a rug and falling hard. The man didn't move, but the orbs did. They floated toward Mark, their hum growing louder. The faces in the ornaments began to scream, though the sound was muted, like it was coming from underwater. Mark scrambled to his feet, bolting for the door. As he ran, he glanced back to see the man standing in front of the tree, his eyes burning brighter. The orbs swirled around him, their light now blinding. He made it home, locking the door behind him and pulling the curtains shut. That night, Emma woke up crying. "There are lights in my room," she whimpered. Mark's blood ran cold. He rushed to her room, but it was empty. The window was open, snow blowing in. On the street below, he saw Emma standing in front of the dark house, staring at the glowing windows. He ran outside, shouting her name. She turned to him, her eyes wide with terror. "Daddy, they want me to decorate the tree." Mark grabbed her, pulling her close as he looked up at the house. The lights were gone, the house dark and silent once more. But in the distance, faint whispers carried on the wind, promising they'd be back next Christmas.
Story number 7.
It was a snowy December evening, and Claire was setting up the last of her Christmas decorations. She just moved into a cozy little cottage on the outskirts of town, hoping for a peaceful holiday away from the bustle of city life. As she unpacked the final box, she found a single red stocking. It wasn't hers. The material was old, the fabric fraying at the edges. A name was stitched into it in faded gold thread. Timothy. Claire furrowed her brow, trying to remember if the stocking had come with the house. Shaking it off as something left behind by the previous owner, she hung it by the fireplace. It added a quaint touch to the room. Later that night, as she settled in with a mug of hot chocolate, she noticed something odd. The stocking was swinging gently, as if caught by a breeze. But the windows were closed. Shrugging it off as her imagination, Claire went to bed. She woke to a soft rustling sound. Her eyes darted to the bedroom door. It was open, though she distinctly remembered closing it. From the hallway came a faint dragging noise, like something being pulled across the wooden floor. Gripping her phone, she crept out of bed and peeked into the living room. The red stocking was now lying on the floor. Its contents spilled out. A handful of small toys, all old-fashioned and worn. A tin soldier with chipped paint, a wooden horse missing one leg, a spinning top that wobbled as if it had just been spun. Her heart pounded. She hadn't put anything in the stocking. Suddenly, a child's laughter echoed through the room, high-pitched and hollow. "Who's there?" Claire whispered, backing away. The toys moved. The tin soldier's head turned sharply toward her, its painted eyes glaring. The wooden horse rocked back and forth, its broken leg creaking. The spinning top rolled toward her feet, stopping with an unnatural precision. Claire froze, unable to tear her eyes away. Then she saw him. A small figure stood by the fireplace, shrouded in shadow. He wore old-fashioned pajamas, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes glinted like glass marbles, reflecting the flickering firelight. "You hung my stocking," he said, his voice soft but tinged with menace. Claire tried to speak, but couldn't. Her throat felt tight, her body frozen. The boy stepped closer, his bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. "Will you fill it this year?" he asked, tilting his head. What do you want?" Claire stammered. He pointed to the mantel. "Put something in the stocking, or I'll take something of yours." The toys began moving again, crawling toward her like insects. The tin soldier's tiny sword glinted, and the wooden horse's rocking grew frantic. Claire grabbed a silver bracelet from her wrist and dropped it into the stocking, her hands shaking. The boy stopped, his glassy eyes narrowing. "Not enough," he hissed. The fireplace roared to life, the flames turning an unnatural green. The room filled with the stench of burning hair and sulfur. Desperate, Claire snatched up a photo of her late mother from the table and placed it into the stocking. The boy's expression softened. He picked up the stocking, cradling it like a prized possession. "Good," he murmured, stepping backward into the shadows. The fire extinguished itself, plunging the room into darkness. When Claire turned on the lights, the boy was gone. The toys lay motionless on the floor, their once animated forms now lifeless. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the stocking was gone. But in its place on the mantel was the photo of her mother, burned at the edges, her smiling face distorted. Claire packed her things that day and never returned to the cottage. Years later, she heard about a fire that destroyed the house. The firefighters claimed it started in the living room near the fireplace. Amidst the ashes, they found a single red stocking, its gold-stitched name still visible, Timothy.
Story number 8.
Mallory had always loved Christmas caroling. It was a tradition in her small town, where neighbors bundled up and walked door to door, singing festive songs and spreading cheer. But this year, Mallory was hesitant. She'd heard whispers about the forgotten carol. The older residents warned the carolers not to sing it. It was an old tune, one that didn't appear in any hymn books or playlists. Supposedly, it had been sung decades ago by a group of carolers who vanished without a trace. "It's just a silly urban legend," Mallory said to her friends as they practiced in her living room. Her best friend Jake grinned mischievously. "Then let's sing it tonight. See what happens." Their group of 6 laughed nervously, unsure if he was joking. Later that evening, as they roamed the snowy streets, the laughter faded into frosty silence. The cold seemed sharper than usual, like biting through their coats and scarves. Jake pulled out his phone, reading from a screenshot he'd taken of the song's lyrics. "Come and join the winter's choir where voices hum and hearts expire. Through the night our song will ring, a carol for the cursed to sing." Mallory felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. "Let's not," she said firmly, but Jake had already begun singing the haunting melody. The others hesitated, then reluctantly joined in. Their voices harmonized eerily, echoing down the empty street. As the last note faded, a strange hush fell over the town. No dogs barking, no wind whistling, not even the crunch of snow beneath their boots. "What the hell was that?" Emma, the youngest in the group, whispered. Jake shrugged. "See? Nothing happened." But something had changed. The streetlights flickered, their warm glow replaced by an unsettling, cold blue. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist, moving unnaturally in the pale light. "We should go," Mallory urged, her voice trembling. As they turned to leave, a figure appeared at the end of the street. It was a man dressed in tattered Victorian clothes, his face obscured by a dark hood. He carried a lantern that flickered with an otherworldly flame. "Who's—" Jake called out, trying to sound brave. The figure didn't answer. Instead, he began to hum. The tune was unmistakable. It was the forgotten carol. "Run!" Mallory screamed, grabbing Jake's arm. The group took off, their boots slipping on the icy ground. But no matter how fast they ran, the humming grew louder, closer. Emma tripped, falling hard onto the frozen pavement. When the others turned to help her, the figure was standing over her, his lantern casting an eerie glow on her terrified face. "Help me," she cried. But as they watched in horror, the light from the lantern seemed to consume her. She vanished, leaving only a patch of frost where she had been. The group fled, tears streaming down their faces. They split up, each hoping to lose the figure. Mallory made it back to her house, slamming the door and locking it. She crouched by the window, peeking out into the dark street. The humming was still there, faint but persistent. One by one, her phone buzzed with texts from the others. "He's outside my house. It's so cold. I can't feel my legs. Lala." The lights went out. "I can't see anything." Mallory's heart sank. Emma couldn't have sent that text. She was already gone. The humming grew louder, echoing through her house. She turned to find the figure standing in her living room, the lantern in his skeletal hand. "Why did you sing my song?" he whispered, his voice like the creak of ancient wood. "I didn't mean to," Mallory stammered, backing away. The figure tilted his head. "The carol must be completed, a voice for each verse." Before she could scream, the lantern's light engulfed her. The next morning, the town was blanketed in a deep silence. 6 sets of footprints led through the snow, but none returned. That night, residents swore they heard voices singing faintly in the distance. "Come and join the winter's choir, where voices hum and hearts expire. Through the night our song will ring, a carol for the cursed to sing."
Story number 9.
The storm had been relentless all day, battering Julia's small remote cabin with snow and wind. She had been looking forward to a quiet Christmas Eve, wrapping presents and sipping cocoa by the fire. But as the hours dragged on, an unsettling sense of isolation began to creep in. The power flickered, and she cursed under her breath. Out here in the woods, outages were common during heavy storms. She lit a few candles, placing them around the room, and tried to settle her nerves. It was then that she noticed it, the sound of crunching snow just outside her window. Her cabin was miles from the nearest neighbor, and no one had mentioned visiting. Her heart pounded as she peered through the frosted glass. Nothing. The storm seemed to play tricks on her senses. The wind howled like a voice, and the trees cast eerie, skeletal shadows across the snow. Julia shook her head and returned to the fireplace, pulling a blanket tightly around her. But then there was a knock, a soft, deliberate knock at the front door. Her stomach churned. No one should be out in this weather. "Hello?" she called, her voice wavering. No answer. Another knock, louder this time. "Who's there?" she demanded, moving toward the door. She grabbed a fireplace poker for protection and slowly unlocked the latch. The icy wind blasted her face as she cracked the door open, revealing nothing but darkness and swirling snow. She stepped outside cautiously, her breath visible in the freezing air. That's when she saw them. Footprints leading up to her door but stopping abruptly, as though the visitor had vanished. Shivering, Julia bolted back inside, locking the door behind her. The knocks returned. Louder, more insistent. "Go away," she shouted, gripping the poker. The knocks stopped. For a moment, the cabin was silent except for the crackle of the fire and the storm outside. Julia's pulse began to steady until she heard something worse, a soft, dragging sound. It was coming from inside the house. She spun around, her eyes darting to the hallway leading to her bedroom. Shadows flickered at the edge of the candlelight. "Who's there?" she whispered, clutching the poker like a lifeline. The dragging sound grew louder, closer. She backed up until she felt the cold, solid wall behind her. Then she saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and impossibly thin. Its face was obscured by a tattered hood, but its eyes glowed faintly, like embers. Its long, bony hand gripped something, a sack that dragged along the floor, leaving dark, wet stains in its wake. Julia's voice caught in her throat. The thing tilted its head as if studying her. "Were you good this year?" it rasped, its voice low and hollow. Julia tried to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. The figure moved closer, its bony fingers reaching toward her. "No," she finally managed, swinging the poker. The figure recoiled, but only for a moment. It dropped the sack, and something heavy rolled out, stopping at Julia's feet. It was a human head, its lifeless eyes staring up at her. The figure lunged, its claw-like hand wrapping around her wrist. The last thing Julia saw was its glowing eyes as the firelight dimmed, leaving her in total darkness. The next day, the storm cleared, and the sun shone on the pristine snow. Julia's cabin sat quiet and undisturbed, save for a single set of footprints leading away into the woods. Inside, the fireplace had burned out, and the room was eerily still. On the mantel, a single note was pinned with a rusty nail. "Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good fright."
Story number 10.
It had been the first heavy snow of the season, and 10-year-old Ellie couldn't contain her excitement. Her parents, newly moved to the secluded countryside, were happy to let her play outside while they finished unpacking. Ellie spent hours building the perfect snowman. She used buttons for eyes, a carrot for the nose, and a scarf she'd found in one of the moving boxes. She even borrowed her dad's old hat to top it off. By the time the sun began to set, the snowman stood tall and proud in the front yard, its grin wide and oddly crooked. "Come see Mom! Dad!" Ellie called, running inside. Her parents obliged, stepping onto the porch to admire her handiwork. "Great job, sweetheart," her mom said with a smile. "Creepy smile, though," her dad joked. Ellie frowned. "It's not creepy, it's happy." As night fell, Ellie couldn't stop glancing at the snowman through the living room window. It seemed to look different in the dark. Its crooked grin appeared wider, more menacing. "You'll have plenty of time to play with it tomorrow," her mom said, ushering her to bed. But Ellie couldn't sleep. She was certain she'd heard crunching footsteps in the snow outside her window. She peeked through the curtains. The snowman was still there, but something was off. Its head seemed to be tilted slightly to the side, as if it were watching her room. Ellie closed the curtains and buried herself under the blankets. The next morning, the snowman was closer. Ellie stood on the porch, staring at it. "Did you move it?" she asked her parents. "Move what?" her dad asked, sipping his coffee. "The snowman. It wasn't that close yesterday." Her mom frowned. It must have been the wind. Ellie wasn't convinced. As the day wore on, she tried to ignore the snowman, but every time she glanced outside, it seemed to have shifted again. By sunset, it was only a few feet from the porch. That night, Ellie locked her window and pulled the covers over her head. At some point, she heard it again. The crunch of snow, slow and deliberate. She held her breath, straining to listen. A soft knock came at her bedroom window. She screamed, bolting for her parents' room. Her dad grabbed a flashlight and went outside to check, but when he returned, he looked puzzled. "There's nothing out there," he said. Ellie didn't sleep the rest of the night. The following morning, the snowman was gone. Relief washed over her until she noticed the footprints. They started where the snowman had been and led directly to her bedroom window. Her parents dismissed it as her imagination, but Ellie knew better. She refused to go outside for days. A week later, during another snowfall, Ellie woke up to find her window frosted over. Something was etched into the glass from the outside, a wide, crooked smile. And just below it, written in the frost, were 3 chilling words, "I'm still here."